and welcome to a new episode of our podcast Connected World. My name is Jelena Žarković and I'm digital transformation consultant in ITI Group. Today with me, one special lady, colleague of mine, Kelsey Crawford. Welcome, Kelsey.
Thank you.
Kelsey was traveling across the pond today to record with me a couple of sessions, and I very much appreciate that. So welcome.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Anytime, Kelsey. So, Kelsey, you are our ITI Senior Digital Transformation Consultant, and you recently joined the group. So, I would enjoy to listen a little bit about your background, as I'm still in that process of meeting you and trying to understand, how I can learn from you properly.
Sure. Where do I start? I'll start from the beginning.
Yeah, please.
So, my background is in chemical engineering. So I went to university for that in London, Ontario at Western. After that, I started working at Deloitte. So kind of like coming out of school, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do because I had done a 16-month internship at a place called Nova Chemicals, and they make plastic, basically. And so I didn't want to be in kind of the refinery or like oil and gas industry my entire career. I wasn't really sure though where I wanted to go. I kind of was thinking, like the pharma space might be interesting. And someone honestly offhand had just recommended, why don't you consider consulting?
Yeah.
And so I found a job posting on Indeed, of all places, for Deloitte, and it was with the supply chain team. And so within that, they have different categories, like more on the procurement side, then also a bit on like the logistics and distribution. And then they had a focus on manufacturing. And that was perfect to me because I've always found it really interesting how the things that we use every day are made. Like, for example, like these microphones or like these couches, how do they get put together on a mass scale and produced?
Yeah.
And that's what I also found specifically interesting about pharma is, reflecting on COVID. How do we mass produce things like the PPE or the vaccine at such a rate that you need for society? So I always found it really interesting and kind of, that show How It's Made. One of my favorite shows to watch when I was a kid with my dad. And that really piqued my interest and kind of led me to the manufacturing route. And a lot of people don't really have a good grasp of what chemical engineering is. A lot of people just assume that it's chemistry, but there's so much about process optimization. So not only, how do you put this process together to, say, manufacture this couch, but how do you do it more effectively? How do you do it greener, considering, carbon offsets and things like that? So I started doing that and kind of got into that after school. And then from there, I was working at Deloitte for about 4.5 years and got a chance to do a little bit of the technical side of things and also a little bit more on the business strategy and kind of helping clients come up with their digitalization strategies, right? So especially in this day and age, Industry 4.0, how do we digitalize our operations to make them more effective? And after that, though, I was kind of ready to do something a little bit more technical and get back to that. And I think that's what led me to our team and what we do, because we play such a pivotal role in companies' digital implementations, which I find really interesting. It's like, how do you, effectively manage and successfully implement digital technologies in the manufacturing world?
You would agree it's a lot of work. And as, as someone who was working in one of big four, right?
Yeah.
What was your biggest challenge so far in adopting digital technologies?
I think the biggest challenges I would say in adopting digital, I think there's two things. One, the classic is there's a difference between implementing a system and truly getting adoption of a system. I think that is always a big challenge, is that change management piece. And
Yes.
so whenever I was working at Deloitte, we would actually do projects with some of our change management team and make sure that we included those important aspects like training, but also how do you get them involved earlier on in even coming up with the strategy, getting business alignment, then getting them involved throughout the implementation as well, is really important. So I think, adoption is going to be always one of those things
Mm-hmm.
that people struggle with the most. But I also think the other is making sure that companies are thinking about, the full approach and the full strategy ahead, because a lot
Yes.
of times we get involved with clients and, they have 4 different teams maybe who are piloting all different softwares. So I've been in scenarios where like the maintenance team is using one sensor to pull some information off a piece of equipment there, but then the operations team is using a whole other technology here. And so if you think about like a full digital transformation, you want to make sure that those are aligned, right? And that you have a consistent strategy that you're going forward with. And how are you going to actually integrate your different systems in the future, right? Because if we think of a lot of what we do, like the manufacturing execution system implementations, that could be step one in lots of different aspects of a digital transformation. How do you integrate your MES with your LIMS? How do you integrate it with your SAP or like your other ERP interface or your CMMS? Like there's so many different aspects that I think companies don't often think about, what is that architecture that I want to use? And then you get into these pitfalls going forward where, oh, we realized we actually needed an iPass here, or we needed an OPC server here that we weren't thinking of originally. So I think that part is where I've seen a lot of it kind of fall apart. Specifically, I was doing one MES implementation and we were trying to integrate with the SAP, like the building out the SAP interface. And there was a lot of master data changes we need in SAP to effectively communicate with the MES. And we didn't include the SAP team in the early
Mm.
discussions of the planning. And so they were a bit taken aback about how much work was going to be on their plate in order to make those updates. And it became a real sticking point in the project plan as well. So it's kind of things like that, you want to be as proactive as possible, thinking about all the different interdependencies whenever you have a digital transformation on the go.
So we would agree here that communication would be probably one of the most important
Uh,
aspects.
100%. Communication in all aspects of
Yeah.
life is one of the most important things, in my
Yeah.
opinion. But yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So I can, in general, I would be a little bit selfish here, maybe not ask what our audience would like to hear. I would like what I would like to
Okay.
hear.
Okay.
So, as someone who predominantly has an experience with pharma and CPG, I would like to hear from you more about maybe oil and gas technologies. And you actually have like a proper experience working on site. So, just share a little bit with me, just to keep me happy and my
Yeah.
curiosity.
Well, so my first job kind of as an intern was at like an oil and gas company. And I did the first 8 months I did in the operations, which is basically underneath a contact engineer. And so I would go out into the plant every day, go out into the control room with the engineers, sit and kind of look at, like the flare monitoring, the different temperature set points, etc. All obviously, how can we make more products? And then I also worked in process controls. And so, like alarm management. So, if you have alarms going on in the plant, obviously, that's a very critical part of the operations because it can be very dangerous. I remember one time I was out in the plant and there was a benzene leak while I was out there. And so it's just like kind of the panicking of, what do you do? Going back to your trainings and um, kind of having that experience. And then I also got to work during a turnaround, which is basically when they shut down the entire plant and they go and open up the pieces of equipment. So I got to crawl within the distillation columns and see inside some of the different tanks and stuff like that. So it was a really good experience, just to kind of understand, what the actual equipment that you're controlling looks like, what are the different pieces of process controls and safety? Like, obviously, that's really important in oil and gas. Sat through different HAZOPs and whatnot, and then did a lot of work in their DCS, like their distributed control system, which I think is the biggest difference now is I'm working a lot more in pharma, like you were saying, or kind of like foods, packaging. And it's a little bit different because with continuous processes, it's more centralized in their SCADA. So the control schemes and things are a bit different in the way that you're controlling the process. Whereas in pharma, it's obviously, batch. And so it's different in the way that you control a subsection of the process. Like say you control your mixing for the next 15 minutes because you have your recipe that you need to adhere to. Whereas in oil and gas, whenever you're controlling your process, it's a continuous flow. So I find that, to be honest, a little bit more interesting. But both of them are quite interesting from a controls perspective as well, because pharma, there's so much regulatory importance as well, obviously, because it's end consumer product that is being potentially consumed. So yeah, both are really interesting, but do have fundamental kind of differences in the way that you control the process.
I actually wanted to ask about your preferable industry, but you answered my question
I mean,
partly.
yeah, it's different. I think for me, I like a bit more the pharma and kind of consumer goods industry just because you get to see it more.
Mhm.
It's a little less abstract. So, if I'm walking, like the other week or two, I was on a site seeing how Listerine was being manufactured. And so that's pretty cool when you actually see in the packaging the Listerine bottles on the shop floor. Um, but at the same time, I like kind of the grandiose aspect of oil and gas when you show up to the site and there's all these massive distillation columns. And again, like there's such a critical importance of controlling that process because of the safety implications it has. So it's kind of tough to choose, to be honest. Probably edges a little bit to pharma and oil and gas.
You don't need to choose your fighter. But I appreciate your answer. Anyway, so I could tell that you're speaking really passionate about your job, and I would like for if you can share with our audience what would be your digital transformation strategy. Do you have one?
I mean, it depends like in kind of what context. I think, the first thing that's really important is aligning on the value
Mm-hmm.
that you're trying to get from your digital transformation. Because the other thing too is a lot of times they'll kind of say, well, we have to transform. Okay, but like where do you want to start and why? I
Mm-hmm.
think is really important. And so going through and understanding what is your business priority?
Mm-hmm.
What are you trying to control for? And from, for example, a pharma perspective,
Mm-hmm.
what I've seen in the most recent while is going towards a electronic batch record. And that's a lot driven by the regulatory guidelines. And just if you think about it, right, where you have someone, dispensing powder into a different container, but then they have to record every single aspect of what they're doing on paper. Then they have to come and get that signed off by someone else and then get that approved by the supervisor. Like there's so many different levels of approvals. So being able to automate that workflow as much as possible and being able to uh, basically reduce as many human errors as possible is a really important thing right now, especially always has been, but more so we're seeing a lot of pharma companies wanting to make that move. But I think um, it's important to understand, what are you trying to do?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's so many different pieces of functionality, and you don't necessarily want to do it all in one big bang either, because then you're going to just lose momentum. So I think it's the other thing too is taking the time, kind of what I was saying about the architecture. So you understand what are you trying to drive to? What's the value you're trying to get? Then you can understand, okay, what solutions or systems do I
Mm-hmm.
need in place to give me that value? Have a clear business case outlined. Then you can start looking into, what is my solution architecture that I want to consider. And I think kind of those are the 3 pieces up front. And then also too, understanding again, like what kind of master data
Hmm.
implications that means, because everyone really likes to think about the systems and, what new tools and what cool things they can do, but they don't understand that that is all dependent upon the quality of data that you're putting into your system. And so for me, that is the most interesting part about digital transformations. It's, how do we look into the nitty-gritty details to actually enable our systems to work properly? I would say is really important. So, yeah, I think kind of getting that outlined and then also going back to the change management piece, making sure that you have, project sponsors, project champions, like people who are willing to, in a way, kind of sell it within your organization, right? Because the last thing you want to do is spend all this time implementing something and then no one wants to use it. So once you have figured out what that value is, make sure that you're properly documenting that and
Hmm.
advertising that in your business. I mean, I think it's also one thing, right? The way that you sell digital implementations, I think a lot of times people are concerned that, they might be out of a job or something
Hmm.
afterwards because they don't know really how it's going to impact them. But from this example, for example, like pharma, it's more trying to aid them
Hmm.
in what they're doing, right? And if you could tell someone probably that, "Hey, you don't need to sign this document 1,000 times. I'll give you a digital bracelet. You can go scan it whenever you finish a step." You're making their life easier. And so I think just being able to communicate that value with all the people who are going to be using the system, also people maybe who aren't but just want to understand it a bit more is a really, really important part of setting you up for success in digital
Yeah,
transformations.
adopting that change is a challenge. So, do you have any? There is no such a thing, such a clear advice, right? But any example of good practice, like in terms of adopting that change very well?
Yeah, I think so. I was supporting one client back in Toronto area. We were going through their equipment qualification process and making changes to that process. And, throughout that, it involved us being on the shop floor hand in hand with the actual operators who are going to be using the system every day. And understanding what they're currently doing, I think, is really important because as soon as people feel heard and they feel like their ideas are included in the system design as well, right? It's like spending that time to understand those upfront pain points. Like maybe they're going to say, hey, I have to click here 10 times to do this, when in reality, I would love to be able to just, click once and it's done. Like I think just giving them that time upfront to have input and feel like they're a part of something bigger and greater as well is so important.
Yeah, sorry, Kelsey, for interrupting, but how to encourage someone to share their real opinion? So you have, in a lot of cases, you have like people working in certain environment for ages, and apparently one day someone wants to change the whole process, and we all know it's not the easiest thing. So how to encourage someone to raise their voice and really share, because people are sometimes scared, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's fair. I think what we typically do is we will have interviews or
Mhm.
kind of sessions with people from the different teams. So, like for example, from the maintenance team, the quality team, operations, engineering, and we try and do it in small enough settings. So, like maybe we go on the shop floor and have a conversation with a couple of the operators, or like observe them and kind of their day to day. And again, I think it's more about connecting with them more as a person than just kind of stomping in and saying, "Hey, we're making this change. Hope you like it." Right? Like it's really important that it's their system
Exactly.
at the end of the day and they take ownership of that. And so I think it's just about conducting those upfront interviews and sessions, but in a bit of a smaller kind of area, or also, like you said, observing what they're doing, because then you'll see, oh, they're really struggling with this part of the process, or you know, you kind of just get a more natural view into their day to day. I think is something that is really important because obviously no one wants anyone to just walk in and assume all of these things about their jobs, right? No one would like that to
Exactly.
happen. So it's important to take that time and do the upfront understanding, which is why I love what we do so much in our team and the consulting aspect about it, because a lots of people can come up with requirements, a list of requirements for a system, but have they taken that upfront time and detail to really understand what's the point of the requirements and why are we doing this? And does it really add value to the end user? I think it's really important to have that mindset.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And sometimes those gaps between as is process and to be process are really massive. So, how to overcome them? So, when you notice that sometimes that's a massive gap and it's not easy to do everything in one go, do you try maybe to advise on client to start small, or sometimes we just want to see the software in some environment, and is software really always the best solution?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple different points within the question there. I think a lot of times I would agree with you. The client typically is like, they want to see something. They don't want to be stuck in this sort of implementation for years and never seeing the final result. So I think always, if there's an opportunity to do a pilot of some sort is always really beneficial. Because then one, that gives them the confidence that they're going to be getting something that they are aligned with and that they enjoy. Two, that also gives the development team a chance to get earlier feedback so they know what direction they need to be going. So I do think that's really important. And then I think, the to be as is to be mapping. I think there's always going to be scenarios where, potentially there's misalignments, right? And for example, I was working at 3 different pharma sites, and we are trying our best to kind of harmonize and consolidate the batch record across the different processes so we could standardize the workflows in the system. And so there was a lot of upfront effort in those design workshops because, one site says, oh, well, I do it this way. Oh, well, I do it this way. So I want to be able to handle this too. And so I think, just understanding in those moments when to push back a little bit and understand, okay, what can we change in your process as well to match what we need to in the system? I think it has to be a little bit of a give and take because you don't want to build such a custom coded system that is going to be extremely difficult to maintain. So potentially there's certain things in the as is process that just it fundamentally needs to be changed. But I think it goes back to, again, trying to make sure everyone's aligned on kind of the future state end goal and what you're trying to do is really important. And then also in those situations, like, there's nothing that can beat, like, a pros con list, to be honest. It's just kinda sitting down and saying, "Okay, like, here's our different options that we can do it. Step 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's the disadvantages and advantages." You get everyone in a call together and you walk it through, and it's all of a sudden when it's, on paper in front of people, decisions become much easier to make. I think that's something that I've really had to use in the past because when you get into actual implementation work, a lot of times there's issues, either pivoting from the original design intent or you come across, something doesn't work the way we were intending in the system. So you're going back to the drawing board a little bit. And that can be a really big inhibitor in implementations is just never quite getting that design fixed and getting in aligned and agreed design decision. I think is being able to do that effectively as a team is probably the most important thing throughout the actual implementation phase in my opinion.
What would be your conclusion for the end of this conversation? Do you have any maybe takeaways for our audience or any advice you would like to point out?
That's a bit of a loaded question. I think ultimately I would say, take the time to do the upfront preparation. Um, and, do that vendor analysis, make sure that it fits to what you need, make sure that you have a clear, aligned kind of North Star or vision of what you want to do for your digitalization strategy. And make sure that you have kind of that governance structure up front and understanding where you want to go because it can be a lot to undertake, but it also can be really rewarding and exciting, as long as you have all of those pieces in place. So I think just really emphasizing the upfront scoping exercises, if you will. Like we were also recently working with a client, kind of trying to help them figure out, what's the way that they want to proceed with their batch record at a different pharma site, and they already have a URS for their weighing and dispensing area. Um, and they wanted to roll that out for mixing and packaging. And, we kind of went back and said, like, that's really great, but have you considered this, this, and this? Maybe let's take a step back. Let's take some time to go through a bit more of a upfront kind of consulting exercise to make sure that we understand, like, we do have the right architecture. How are things mixing and packaging potentially going to impact your weighing and dispensing area as well? So just making sure that you're looking at things kind of from a bigger picture instead of just trying to get sucked in so quickly,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
it absolutely does. So thank you, Kelsey. Thank you for sharing everything with us today and our audience. And it was such a pleasure having you with me today in the studio.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun chatting.
So it was our excellent Kelsey Crawford today speaking with me about a topic you are all interested in. It was a pleasure having her today, and see you in our next episode.